What if I told you that one of the most beautiful love stories ever written started with 3 funerals, a famine, and a foreign woman making the most radical decision of her life? What if I told you that this story would change the course of history, leading directly to the birth of Jesus Christ? And what if I told you that it all began when a young widow looked at her grieving mother-in-law and said 6 words that would echo through eternity? Where you go, I will go. This isn't just a story about finding love. This is about finding home, finding purpose, and discovering that sometimes God's greatest blessings come disguised as our biggest losses. Welcome to the story of Ruth. Setting the scene. Our story begins during the time of the Judges, a chaotic period in Israel's history when everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Think of it as the Wild West of biblical times. No king, no central authority, just a collection of tribes trying to figure out how to follow God in a land full of temptation. Bethlehem, which ironically means house of bread, is experiencing famine. The town that would one day provide bread for the world can't even feed its own people. Among those affected is a family we're about to meet. Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Faced with starvation, Elimelech makes a decision that seems practical but feels spiritually risky. He packs up his family and heads to Moab, a neighboring country with food but a complicated relationship with Israel. The Moabites weren't exactly enemies, but they weren't friends either. They were the descendants of Lot, connected to Israel by blood but separated by belief. Imagine the conversations around that family dinner table. We're moving where? To live among people who worship different gods? Dad, are you sure about this? But sometimes survival trumps spiritual comfort zones. And sometimes God's plan includes detours we never saw coming. Tragedy strikes. What starts as a temporary solution becomes a permanent relocation. The family settles in Moab, and the sons do what young men do. They fall in love. Mahlon marries Ruth, and Chilion marries Orpah, both Moabite women. For about 10 years, life seems to stabilize. The famine is behind them, the boys have wives, and maybe Naomi is starting to imagine grandchildren. But then tragedy strikes like lightning in a clear sky. First, Elimelech dies. Then, in what must have felt like a cruel cosmic joke, both sons die as well, leaving 3 widows in a culture where widows were one step away from destitute. Picture Naomi's world collapsing. In a single chapter, she loses her husband, her sons, her security, and her future. In ancient times, a woman's identity and survival were tied to the men in her life. First her father, then her husband, then her sons. Naomi has lost all 3 anchors, and she's drowning in grief and bitterness in a foreign land. Meanwhile, Ruth and Orpah are facing their own impossible choice. They're young, probably still capable of remarrying and starting new families. But staying with Naomi means tying their futures to an aging, bitter woman with no prospects and no inheritance to offer. The decision that changed everything. When Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem, she sits her daughters-in-law down for what must have been the most painful conversation of her life. In essence, she tells them, "Girls, I love you, but you need to save yourselves. Go back to your mother's homes, find new husbands, have the children and the future I can never give you." It's heartbreaking in its practicality. Naomi isn't being cruel, she's being realistic. She has nothing to offer these young women except hardship and uncertainty. In her mind, releasing them is the kindest thing she can do. Orpah, after much weeping and what we can imagine was agonizing deliberation, makes the sensible choice. She kisses Naomi goodbye and heads back to her people and her gods. The text doesn't condemn her for this. It was the logical, culturally expected decision. But Ruth does something that defies every social norm and practical consideration. She clings to Naomi and delivers what might be the most beautiful speech about loyalty ever recorded. "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." Can you imagine Naomi's shock? This young woman is choosing poverty over prosperity, uncertainty over security, and a foreign god over familiar ones. Ruth is essentially saying, "I'm not just committed to you, Naomi. I'm committed to your God, your people, and your future, whatever that looks like." The journey home. The journey from Moab to Bethlehem wasn't just a change of address. It was a complete identity transformation. Ruth is walking away from everything she's ever known: her culture, her gods, her family, her language, her potential for remarriage within her own people. Picture the two women walking those dusty roads, Naomi probably wondering if she's ruined this young woman's life, and Ruth probably wondering what on earth she's gotten herself into. But sometimes the most important journeys begin with the least certainty about the destination. When they arrive in Bethlehem, the whole town is stirred. "Can this be Naomi?" the women ask. 10 years away, plus grief and hardship, have clearly taken their toll. And Naomi's response reveals the depth of her pain. "Don't call me Naomi," which means pleasant. "Call me Mara," which means bitter, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. It's raw, honest, and deeply human. Naomi isn't putting on a brave face or spouting spiritual platitudes. She's essentially saying, God has emptied me out, and I'm not okay with it. Sometimes faith includes the freedom to be honest about our disappointment with God. Ruth in the harvest fields. Now here's where the story gets interesting. Ruth and Naomi are broke, and in ancient Israel, that meant survival mode. Fortunately, God had built a social safety net into the law: gleaning. Landowners were required to leave the corners of their fields unharvested and not to go back for grain they missed, allowing the poor, widows, and foreigners to gather what remained. Ruth, showing the same initiative that marked her decision to follow Naomi, says, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." She's not sitting around waiting for a miracle. She's actively seeking God's provision through available means. But here's the beautiful part. Ruth happens to find herself gleaning in the field belonging to Boaz, who happens to be a relative of Naomi's late husband. The text says she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. In Hebrew, the word suggests chance, but any reader of Scripture knows there's no such thing as coincidence in God's economy. Boaz arrives to check on his harvest and immediately notices Ruth. This isn't a love-at-first-sight moment. It's more complex than that. Boaz sees a foreign woman working diligently in his field and asks his foreman, "Who does that young woman belong to?" In that culture, women were identified by their relationships to men, so the question reveals both concern and curiosity, and unexpected kindness. When Boaz learns that Ruth is the Moabite woman who came back with Naomi, something shifts in his demeanor. He approaches Ruth directly, unusual in itself, and speaks to her with remarkable kindness. "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me." But it gets better. He instructs his men not to touch her, gives her access to their water, and even invites her to eat with his workers. When Ruth asks why she's found such favor, Boaz's answer reveals that her reputation has preceded her. "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before." Boaz recognizes Ruth's sacrifice and honors it. He sees past her foreign status to her faithful heart. And then he says something that gives us chills. "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." The imagery is beautiful. Ruth has flown to God for shelter like a bird seeking protection under its mother's wings. And Boaz is recognizing that this foreign woman has chosen to trust in Israel's God. Naomi's hope rekindles. When Ruth returns home that evening with an ephah of barley, about half a bushel, way more than a typical gleaner would gather, plus leftover food from lunch, Naomi's interest is immediately piqued. "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." And when Ruth mentions Boaz's name, it's like a light switches on in Naomi's eyes. "The Lord bless him," she exclaims. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." Then comes the revelation that changes everything. That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. A kinsman redeemer, Goel in Hebrew, was a relative responsible for protecting family interests. This included buying back land sold due to poverty, marrying a widow to continue the family line, and ensuring that the family name and inheritance didn't disappear. It was a role that combined legal obligation with moral responsibility. Suddenly, Naomi realizes that their desperate situation might not be hopeless after all. God hasn't forgotten them. He's been orchestrating provision through the kindness of a relative they didn't even know cared about them. The harvest season continues. Ruth continues gleaning in Boaz's fields through both the barley and wheat harvests, several months of steady provision and growing relationship. During this time, she's not just gathering grain, she's building reputation, trust, and what we might cautiously call affection. Boaz watches this foreign woman work with integrity day after day. He sees her loyalty to Naomi, her diligence in providing for both of them, and her respectful interaction with his workers. Meanwhile, Ruth experiences kindness and protection in Boaz's field that she hasn't known since her husband died. But neither of them makes a move beyond professional courtesy. Boaz, as an older, established man, probably doesn't want to take advantage of a vulnerable woman. Ruth, as a foreigner and widow, wouldn't dare presume to pursue someone so far above her social station. They're both being appropriate, honorable, and completely stuck. Enter Naomi with a plan that's either brilliant or scandalous, depending on your perspective. The threshing floor encounter. Naomi pulls Ruth aside and essentially says, "My daughter, I need to find you a home where you will be well provided for. Tonight, Boaz will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking." The plan gets more specific. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying, then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. Now let's pause here because this sounds either incredibly romantic or incredibly inappropriate, depending on how you read it. In our modern context, a woman sneaking up on a sleeping man and lying down with him sounds like a recipe for scandal. But understanding the cultural context is crucial. The threshing floor was a public place where grain was processed and often where business was conducted. Boaz would likely have slept there to guard the grain, probably with other workers nearby. Ruth's actions, uncovering his feet and lying down, were a symbolic way of asking for his protection and indicating her willingness to marry him. In that culture, a woman could initiate marriage proceedings, and this was the accepted way to do it. Still, it required enormous courage. Ruth is risking reputation, rejection, and possibly accusation of impropriety. Midnight conversation. Picture the scene. Boaz wakes up in the middle of the night, probably feeling a chill on his feet, and discovers a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asks. A reasonable question under the circumstances. Ruth's response is both humble and bold. "I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." She's essentially proposing marriage using the imagery Boaz himself had used months earlier about God's wings providing refuge. Now she's asking Boaz to be the human instrument of that divine protection. Boaz's response reveals both his character and his feelings. "The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." He's clearly honored by her proposal, but there's a problem. There's another relative who has a prior claim as kinsman redeemer. Boaz promises to handle the legal details, but first he loads Ruth up with 6 measures of barley to take home, both as provision and as a sign of his intent to fulfill his promise. The city gate resolution. The next morning, Boaz heads to the city gate, the ancient equivalent of a courthouse and business district combined. When the closer relative passes by, Boaz calls him over and gathers 10 elders as witnesses. In front of this impromptu legal assembly, he presents the situation. Naomi is selling the land that belonged to Elimelech, and the nearest relative has the right to redeem it. The relative is interested until Boaz mentions the catch. "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." Suddenly, the relative backs out. "Then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself." "I cannot do it." We're not told exactly why he changed his mind, but possibilities include the cost of supporting Ruth and Naomi, the complexity of inheritance issues, or possibly prejudice against Ruth's Moabite heritage. Whatever the reason, his withdrawal clears the way for Boaz. In the ancient equivalent of signing a contract, the relative takes off his sandal and gives it to Boaz, a symbolic transfer of rights and responsibilities. Boaz announces to the witnesses that he's redeeming the land and taking Ruth as his wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. the wedding and beyond. The community's response is beautiful. The elders and all the people at the gate say, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel." They're not just blessing a marriage, they're prophesying a legacy. And their words prove prophetic in ways they couldn't have imagined. Boaz takes Ruth as his wife, and the Lord enables her to conceive. When their son is born, the women of Bethlehem gather around Naomi with congratulations that reveal how completely Ruth has been accepted. Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. Notice what they call Ruth, not the Moabite woman or the foreigner, but your daughter-in-law who loves you. Ruth has found her place, her people, and her purpose. The story ends with Naomi holding her grandson, her bitterness transformed into joy, her emptiness filled with abundance. The women even name the child Obed, meaning servant or worshiper. The genealogical surprise. But the story doesn't end with a happy family. The final verses deliver a genealogical bombshell. So Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. This is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. David, as in King David, as in the line that leads directly to Jesus Christ. This foreign woman who made a radical choice to follow an unknown God didn't just find personal redemption. She became part of the messianic lineage. Matthew's genealogy in the New Testament specifically mentions Ruth as one of only 4 women included in Jesus' family tree. A Moabite widow who chose faith over familiarity became a great-great-grandmother of the Savior of the world. Spiritual themes and divine providence. Ruth's story is a masterclass in how God works through ordinary circumstances to accomplish extraordinary purposes. Every coincidence in the story, Ruth happening to glean in Boaz's field, Boaz happening to notice her, the closer relative declining to redeem, reveals divine providence orchestrating human choices. The story also demonstrates that God's family is bigger than bloodlines. Ruth, the foreigner, becomes more integral to God's plan than many native Israelites. Her loyalty to Naomi and faith in Israel's God earn her a place in the messianic lineage, proving that God evaluates hearts, not heritage. It's a story about redemption on multiple levels. Boaz redeems the land, Ruth redeems Naomi's future, and both find personal redemption from loneliness and loss. But ultimately, it points to Christ, our ultimate kinsman redeemer, who paid the price we couldn't pay to bring us into God's family. Modern applications. What does Ruth's story mean for us today? It teaches us that loyalty and faithfulness, even when costly, are never wasted in God's economy. Ruth's decision to stay with Naomi seemed to offer no immediate benefit, but it positioned her for blessings she couldn't have imagined. Second, it reminds us that God can write beautiful new chapters in our lives, no matter how devastating the previous ones have been. Naomi went from bitter widow to joyful grandmother. Ruth went from foreign widow to honored matriarch. Both experienced redemption beyond their wildest dreams. Third, it shows us that our small acts of faithfulness can have ripple effects far beyond our knowledge. Ruth just wanted to take care of Naomi, but her faithfulness contributed to the lineage of Christ. Fourth, it demonstrates that God often provides through the kindness of others. Boaz's character and generosity became the instrument of God's provision for Ruth and Naomi. Finally, it reminds us that our backgrounds don't disqualify us from God's purposes. Ruth's Moabite heritage could have been a barrier, but God used it as part of His plan to show that His salvation extends to all peoples. Personal reflection. Maybe you're in your own Moab right now, a place you never planned to be, dealing with losses you never expected to face. Maybe you're like Naomi, feeling bitter about how life has turned out. Or maybe you're like Ruth, facing a decision between safety and faithfulness, between the familiar and the unknown. Ruth's story reminds us that God specializes in redemption stories. He takes our broken pieces and creates beautiful mosaics. He turns our happens to moments into divine appointments. He uses our faithfulness in small things to prepare us for greater purposes. Your current chapter of struggle isn't your final chapter. God is writing a story of redemption in your life. And sometimes the most beautiful plots include the most unexpected turns. Friends, I want to challenge you today to look for God's providence in your ordinary circumstances. Where might He be positioning you for purposes you can't yet see? What acts of faithfulness is He calling you to, even when the outcome is uncertain? If Ruth's story encouraged you today, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder that redemption is always possible. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time when God turned your Moab into something beautiful. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our explorations of the stories that shaped faith and continue to shape hearts. Because your story isn't finished yet, and the God who orchestrated Ruth's redemption is still writing beautiful endings to difficult chapters. Remember, the same God who guided Ruth from Moab to Bethlehem, from gleaning in fields to royalty and lineage, from widow to wife to great-grandmother of kings, that same God is guiding your story today. He sees your faithfulness, He honors your loyalty, and He's preparing blessings you can't yet imagine. Your God is writing your redemption story, one faithful choice at a time. Until next time, stay faithful, stay hopeful, and keep watching for God's hand in your harvest fields. May you find refuge under His wings.